Hitler's female assistants, the women guards of the Nazi concentration camps. Spring 1943, the industrial complex of death at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Vapors of carbolic acid, Zyklon B, still hung over the crematoria gas chambers, mixing with the smoke from the piles of bodies. The scene, gray and mechanized, had a subtle but perverse particularity. It wasn't just the gray uniforms of the male SS performing the selection on the ramping. Standing under the acidic mist observing the flow of newly arrived deportees was a young woman. Irmgard Gries, 20 years old, a guard's uniform, a rattan whip in her hand. In contrast to the moral ugliness of the environment, her face was strangely beautiful, a biological paradox in the architecture of hell. As the extermination machine expanded, the need for personnel in the Schutzstaffel, SS, reached critical levels. In Berlin, in the offices of the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltung Hauptamt, the SS main economic and administrative office, the concern was efficiency, not gender ideology. The SS, the elite racial apparatus, did not see these women as warriors. They were mere SS-Helferinnen, auxiliaries. General Oswald Pohl, head of the WVHA, considered female recruitment a second-class logistical solution to the scarcity of men transferred to the front. Speeches and Reports, Voice of Pohl, Communication Excerpt, 1942. The filling of guard positions, Aufseherinnen, must be accelerated. They are not for tactical combat, but for disciplinary enforcement. Their function is to supervise the female masses in the barracks. It is routine work, requiring only loyalty to the Reich and a suitable temperament for command. The female nature should give us greater control over the hysteria and disorganization of the prisoners. Pohl's perception was that these women would be mere bureaucratic matrons, fulfilling minor tasks. He drastically underestimated the capacity of the totalitarian system to induce sadism and active malice in any individual willing to adhere.
Recruitment and initial criticism. The female recruitment project, driven by the expansion of the camp system, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Majdanek, was born out of operational necessity. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls, served as an ideological nursery. Formal recruitment, however, came from newspaper advertisements, packaged in a generic patriotic appeal, "Serve the Reich." The initial profile of the candidates was for the most part lower or middle class, former hairdressers, retired teachers, streetcar conductors, women without a history of violence but lacking professional experience. Critical failure 1. Decentralized training. Training was rudimentary, centered at Ravensbrück, the female model camp, and generally lasted only a few weeks. There was no rigorous psychological screening system. Training was summarized as indoctrination, unconditional loyalty to the SS-Gefalge, and mass control techniques, rigid discipline, use of whips and dogs to terrorize. Criticism. SS Internal Informal Report, 1943. Many SS officers questioned the status of these women. Oberaufseher and Hertahasi Breitmann Schmidt would later claim they were not full SS members, creating legal confusion in the post-war era regarding their direct responsibility for war crimes. They were auxiliaries, but they operated at the interface of mass murder. The emergence of cruelty. However, daily exposure to absolute power and the systematic dehumanization of prisoners transformed bureaucracy into sadism. The role of supervisor quickly evolved into that of active torturer. Women like Maria Mondl, who in Birkenau did not wait for prisoners to inspect them, but waited for them to turn to her, a movement that meant immediate death. Women like Ilse Koch, who transcended protocol through personal sadism, collecting tattooed human skin. The SS's initial underestimation of feminine fragility was transformed into a reality of amplified brutality. Survivor prisoner post-war testimony. The male guard was an oppressor, but the female guard, she was evil on a more intimate, more personal scale. She looked you in the face before whipping you. The SS sought loyal supervisors. It found something much worse, faces of malice, disguised under gray uniforms, ready to become the personification of terror. And their legacy would be eternalized not by their contributions to the Reich, but by the weight of a rope.
2.1. The process of dehumanization and active sadism. The psychology of the Aufseherinnen. If the SS expected matrons, the concentration camp system produced something more sinister. The psychology of these 5,000 women, the Aufseherinnen, is a case study in the banality of evil and its escalation to active sadism. Most of the guards were not initially sociopaths or clinically sadistic. They were the product of a totalitarian ideology that offered them, for the first time in their lower and middle-class lives, absolute power and social status. The SS Gefalge placed them above millions of subhumans. The culture of the whip. The psychological process was simple. Fear, hunger, and the constant threat of punishment, not from the prisoners, but from the superior SS, demanded brutal conformity. Violence was the performance metric. Women like Maria Mandl, the beast of Auschwitz, quickly internalized this culture. She was an Austrian SS-Helferin who rose to Lagerführerin, leader of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Under her direct control, it is estimated that over 500,000 prisoners were killed. Testimony of Sala Feder, Krakow District Court, 1947. On the Birkenau ramp, Mandl carried out a selection. I saw her tear children from their mother's arms. When a young woman tried to defend her child, Mandl kicked and beat her so cruelly that she could no longer stand up. I was beside her. She beat me so much that my teeth were knocked out with her shoe. For Mandl and her protégés, like Irmgard Grace, violence was not merely an instrument of discipline. It was a sadistic sport, an affirmation of superiority that mitigated their own prior feeling of social inferiority and irrelevance before the war.
2.2. The dark side of power, corruption and Ilskak. The Witch of Buchenwald. Cruelty in the Nazi camps was not solely motivated by ideology. It was also a criminal enterprise. No one personifies corruption and personal depravity more than Ilse Koch, the notorious Witch of Buchenwald. Ilse was the wife of Commander Karl Koch, which gave her unparalleled operational freedom. She used the camp as her personal domain for enrichment and the satisfaction of morbid fetishes. The Koch couple was known for embezzling millions of Reichsmarks from money confiscated from prisoners. Ilse's extravagance included financing the construction of an indoor riding arena at Buchenwald, with costs exceeding 250,000 Reichsmarks, paid for with the blood and forced labor of the prisoners. But the most heinous corruption was her collection of human material. Testimony, Nuremberg trial, Buchenwald prisoner. Prisoners with unusual tattoos had to report to the infirmary. After being examined by Ilse Koch, those with the most artistic designs were murdered. Their skin was removed and tanned to make lampshades, book covers, and gloves. Koch's sadism was fetishistic and capitalistic. She transformed death into bourgeois decorative objects, raising dehumanization to a new level of trivialization of horror. Ironically, the SS, obsessed with order, ended up convicting and executing Karl Koch in 1945, not for his crimes against prisoners, but for financial corruption, embezzlement of Reich funds.
2.3. Gender relations and the status of comrades. The ambiguous position in the hierarchy. Despite the claim of not being full SS members, the Aufseherinnen in the camps placed them in a complex gender dynamic with their male colleagues. Heinrich Himmler himself, chief of the SS,
encouraged SS men to view the female guards as equals and comrades. These relationships were not just professional, they were often sexual and openly promiscuous, reflecting the distorted morality within the structure of absolute power in the camp. Example of Helmbrechts. In the relatively small subcamp of Helmbrechts, the commander, Wilhelm Dohr, maintained a public sexual relationship with the chief supervisor, Herta Hasse Breitmann-Schmidt. This type of relationship consolidated the Aufseherinnen's position of power, giving her direct access to authority and, consequently, license for cruelty. The contrast and collective moral corruption. The acceptance of women as partners in extermination erased any moral barrier. The female presence normalized the routine of death. The only notable exception documented was Clara Koenig, a guard at Ravensbrück and Dresden. Koenig was described as very polite and kind to the female inmates, a failure in terms of SS discipline that resulted in her dismissal in January 1945. Her kindness was a dangerous anomaly for the system. For the others, union with the male SS was a stamp of approval. They were agents of a state policy, and their cruelty was, in practice, encouraged. The woman who embraced the whip and sadism was an ideological comrade. This symbiosis between female sadism and male corruption created the perfect environment for the rise of figures who would become dark legends in the post-war era. Figures like the young Irmgard Grace, whose beauty only accentuated the depth of her moral abyss.
3. Irmgard Grace, the case study of the beautiful beast. 3.1. The conversion to ideological fury. Youth and the search for belonging. Irmgard Ilse Ida Grace, born in 1923, was the personification of the superficial Aryan ideal, blonde, young, and, at the height of her malice, only 20 years old. But her conversion to terror was more than aesthetic. It was a search for purpose, shaped by a dysfunctional family environment. In her adolescence, Grace yearned to join the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. The Reich's ideology offered the discipline and belonging that she lacked at home, especially after her mother's suicide. The conflict with her father, a farmer, was visceral. He vehemently opposed her entry into the SS-Gefolge, SS Support Organization. Family Account 1943. Grace's commitment to the Nazi war machine was so absolute that it culminated in a complete break with her father. He threw her out of the house. Grace exchanged home and family morality for the gray uniform and the promise of power of the Reich. Her loyalty was total and fanatical, a transference of devotion. Ravensbrück, the supervisor factory. Before she was 17, Grace entered the Ravensbrück training base, the exclusively female camp that served as a school camp for cruelty. There, the naive young woman was quickly indoctrinated and militarized, being transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau in March 1943. In Auschwitz, she became an Aufseherin, a block supervisor. But her ambition and indifference to suffering made her rise rapidly, eventually becoming director of the women's section at the subsequent Bergen-Belsen camp. 3.2. The sadistic routine in Auschwitz. The whip and the selector. Grace's routine in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the heart of the Holocaust, was marked by random violence and participation in the logistics of death. Grace was known for walking the camp wearing a pair of high boots and carrying a braided rattan whip. Her cruelty was especially directed at Polish and Hungarian Jewish women. Testimony: survivor prisoner. She seemed to enjoy the suffering. She whipped women for pleasure, not discipline. She had dogs trained to attack if a prisoner dared to look at her on the ramp. Her most technical involvement in the genocide was the most shocking: the selection for the gas chambers. Together with the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, Grace participated in the sorting of newcomers on the ramp. Thousands of women and children descended from the cattle cars, and Grace decided, with a simple flick of her hand, who would go to the gas chamber and who would live momentarily for slave labor. Her indifference in the presence of mass death made her a direct accomplice.
Beauty as a mask. Greece, due to her remarkably attractive appearance, received sinister nicknames from the prisoners: the Bitch of Auschwitz and the Beautiful Beast. The contrast between her youth and beauty and the atrocity of her acts created a psychological dissonance that made her even more terrifying. Evil in Irmgard, Greece, was aesthetically deceptive.
3.3. The Belsen Trial and the Abrupt End. Capture and the Tribunal. In March 1945, Greece was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. When the British Army liberated the camp on April 17th, the scene they found was one of indescribable horror: piles of bodies, famine, and disease. Greece was captured along with other SS members who failed to flee. The subsequent Belsen trial, Lüneburg, Lower Saxony, placed Irmgard, Greece among the 45 people accused of war crimes, including the camp commander, Josef Kramer, the Beast of Belsen. The global press fixed upon the young guard, labeling her the Beautiful Beast, highlighting her appearance as a way to contextualize the horror. Her trial became a media spectacle of Nazi depravity. Sentence and execution. The detailed testimony of survivors, the torture, the beatings, the participation in selections was overwhelming. After 9 weeks of depositions, Greece was found guilty of war crimes. She was only one of 3 Aufseherinnen sentenced to death alongside Johanna Bormann and Elisabeth Volkenroth. Upon hearing the verdict, Greece remained defiant. The system that created her and morally absolved her in life now legally condemned her. December 13, 1945, Hamelin Prison. Greece and Bormann, reports say, sang Nazi songs the night before. When led to the gallows for execution by long drop hanging, Greece uttered her last words to the executioner: "Schnell," meaning quick. Irmgard, Greece, the 22-year-old beautiful beast, was the final proof that the SS ideology could corrupt morality, gender, and even youth, transforming them into mere vectors for evil.
4. Ilse Koch, the corruption that outlasted the war. 4.1. The Allied Trial and the General Clay Controversy. Detention and the First Sentence. While Irmgard Gracie was summarily hanged by the British Army for war crimes, the fate of Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, was infinitely more complicated, revealing the cracks in post-war justice and the politics of occupation. Koch was arrested by American authorities in 1945 and tried in 1947 at the Buchenwald trial in Dachau. Charges included inciting the murder of prisoners, abuses, and the infamous collection of tattooed human skin. Koch was sentenced to life imprisonment. The decision of Lucius Clay. The controversy erupted in 1948 with the intervention of General Lucius D. Clay, the military governor of the U.S. occupation zone in Germany. Clay, who had final authority over American sentences, reviewed Koch's case. Statement of Lucius Clay, Cold War context. "We were not trying her for things the press accused her of. We were trying her as a war criminal on specific charges. I reduced her sentence to 4 years because the case against her for crimes against American or Allied prisoners was inconclusive." Clay maintained that most of Koch's crimes had been committed against German citizens, labeled as criminals and antisocial elements, and therefore did not constitute war crimes under strict American military jurisdiction. Furthermore, Koch was pregnant at the time, which may have influenced the judgment on the need to postpone execution.
Clay's decision to reduce the life sentence to just 4 years and Koch's subsequent release in 1949 caused an international uproar. The U.S. Senate and public opinion were outraged. The impunity granted to such an infamous figure threatened to undermine the moral authority of the Allies. 4.2. The triumph of German justice and the family tragedy. The second sentence. Due to intense public pressure, Koch was promptly rearrested in 1949 and handed over to the judicial system of the newly formed West Germany. In 1951, a German court tried her for the same crimes, this time against German citizens. Despite the difficulty of concrete evidence directly linking Ilse Koch to the manufacture of human skin lampshades, the evidence was largely testimonial, and the artifacts were partially lost. The court sentenced her again to life imprisonment.
Ilse Koch's fate in Eichach prison became a case study on the transgenerational legacy of the Holocaust. While serving her sentence, she gave birth to a son, Uwe Kohler, conceived with a fellow prisoner in Dachau. Uwe was immediately separated from his mother. At the age of 19, Uwe discovered the truth about his mother, the witch of Buchenwald, and began visiting her. He desperately tried to humanize her, seeking a trace of affection or remorse. Another of her children with Karl Koch had committed suicide after the war, unable to live with the shame of parental crimes. September 1st, 1967. After decades of imprisonment, tormented by delusions that prisoners would come to abuse her in her cell, Ilse Koch committed suicide by hanging at the age of 60. Her final letter to her son, Uwe, contained no remorse for her crimes, only the self-pity typical of a fanatic. 4.3. The Enigma of Impunity. The Guards Who Escaped. The Unequal End. The fate of Ilse Koch and Irmgard Grace, the gallows and prison suicide, was the exception. The overwhelming majority of the 5,000 Aufseherinnen did not face justice or were acquitted. Johanna Altvater. Her case illustrates the system's failure to deal with non-military cruelty. Altvater was not a camp guard, but a civilian secretary in occupied Ukraine. Witnesses accused her of acts of horrific personal violence, such as murdering Jewish children by smashing their heads against walls and throwing babies from windows. The Altvater Enigma. German trial, 1979 to 1982. Altvater was tried and, surprisingly, acquitted twice by German courts due to contradictory testimonies and lack of documentary evidence. She lived a quiet life, married, adopted a child, and died peacefully in 2003. Herta Botha. Sentenced to 10 years at the Belsen trial, Botha was released in 1951. Years later, in a rare interview, questioned about regret, she responded with terrifying bureaucratic coldness. "What do you mean? I made a mistake, didn't I?" The Nazi concentration camp system trained moral indifference. For many Aufseherinnen, their participation in mass murder was a job, a series of tasks. The early release and acquittal of many of them demonstrate the legal difficulty of proving direct murderous intent in a system where death was the bureaucratic norm, not the individual deviation. The true face of evil in this case was not only the sadistic cruelty of figures like Grace and Mondel. It was the mass acceptance, the bureaucratic coldness, and the subsequent structural failure of justice to hold thousands of women accountable who consciously chose the whip over decency. The shadow of the Aufseherin rests not only upon the crematoria of Auschwitz, but upon the silent post-war tribunals, where acquittal sealed the pact that for many, the cost of genocide would be 0.